this is Count Zero. Apologies for the somewhat dimmer video quality. I'm doing another evening video shoot this time. And this time I'm doing a review of a book. The Diamond Throne by David Eddings. This is a book which a lot of my peers read in middle school and high school. I didn't. Not because I'm snobby about fantasy literature. I read a lot of fantasy literature. In fact, I was reading a lot of fantasy literature around the time. In particular, around the time I just started reading the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series by Fritz Leiber. Mainly because I'd been told that I wasn't old enough to read it before then, and now that I was old enough, or my parents said I was old enough, I just ate that stuff up. And so this time I'm going to basically fill in some of my literary gaps in terms of my background of fantasy literature. David Eddings is a writer who I had heard of before, mainly through his, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, the Belgariad, and the Malloreon. Two series which kind of put him into the category of, well, Terry Brooks, in terms of those fantasy authors who were kind of, sort of, Tolkien ripoffs. Not Tolkien ripoffs, but borrowing heavily from Tolkien. And so, those books also tend to be very long. They're, in terms of, not just in terms of size, I mean, this book isn't small either, but in terms of number of books in the series, 5 to 6 books more for revisiting for when they revisited their series later. But when it comes to the but this series, the Elenium, is shorter. It's a trilogy, and to my knowledge has remained a trilogy. He didn't revisit it later. So I think it's a better place to jump right into his, to Eddings' catalog. There will be some spoilers in this review, some possibly very heavy spoilers. However, being this is a book that's published in 1989, get over it. The spoiler statute of limitations has long since expired. The book starts out with a little prologue telling the history of a stone called the Bellum. It's a gemstone that was created by a sort of goblin troll thingy, which I don't think we get a name for. I didn't catch it when I first read the book, and I didn't catch it when I scribbled my notes. Here it is. Gwerhig. By the way, if I mispronounce any names in this book, either of the more Frenchish names or Germanic names that I mentioned in reference to other materials or the items in the book, post it in the comments. Especially if it's a real word, a phonetic spelling of the name would be wonderful, just so I know how to spell it, pronounce it properly. Anyway. And basically the origin of the Bellum is kind of like an amalgamation of Gollum's story of the One and his relationship to the One Ring, and the forging of the Ring of the Nibelung in the Ring Cycle by Richard Wagner. For those who are unfamiliar with Wagner, a brief explanation of what the Ring Cycle is for those who don't already know. The Ring Cycle basically, and particularly the early sections related to the Nibelungen, relate to this being called the Nibelung, who tricks the Rhine Maidens, magical beings who frolic in the Rhine River, into giving up the Rheingold, or Rheingeld is probably the more proper Germanic pronunciation of it, which is a magical piece of gold, which if formed into a ring, gives the person who wears it great power. He then in turn is tricked into giving it up by Wotan, who needs it for his own reasons. Listen to the opera, or watch the opera. I'm not going to go more in depth on that there. Maybe in a future review thing. Yes, I'm recommending that you watch opera. You should watch opera. It's not as bad as you think. moving on. Let's skip ahead untold generations to the capital, the Kingdom of Valynia, where Sir Sparhawk, our main character, is coming home. And Sparhawk is basically sort of a Han Solo figure, which is a nice change for fantasy literature. Most characters early on tend to start very naive, with a limited view of the world. And this is nice. And this is really a nice change, even with the Fafhrd and the Grey Master series, which I love a lot, which I love dearly. It's my favorite literary series. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser both are very provincial in their worldview, while Fafhrd, on his barbarian lands, tries to soak up as many stories of other kingdoms and other lands as possible. They're not well traveled at the start of their tales. We said really quickly that Sparhawk is well traveled. He's been in more than a few fights, and he's made more than a few enemies. They'll introduce his Order of Knights, the Pandian Knights. There are other orders which we come across later, but they're not fleshed out as well as the Pandians are. They're okay. As far as they're paladins. When I say they're okay, I don't mean they're like mediocre or neutral. They're fairly standard paladins. They have some magical abilities, which I'll get into briefly later. And we also introduced to this section fairly quickly Kurik, Sparhawk's squire, who is apparently unable to become a knight himself because of class distinctions, which is odd because with squires, at least in medieval times, they were meant to be knights in training. And in addition to being additional foot soldiers and that sort of thing. That was the reason you became a squire, was you were planning to become a knight later, or there was the anticipation of becoming a knight later through great deeds or actions in battle or conquest or that sort of thing. It wasn't just being a general soldier for hire. And we also fairly quickly establish the power struggles going on in the Kingdom of Valynia. Specifically, here's what's going on. The Queen of the Kingdom, or Queen of the Kingdom, is currently indisposed. And by indisposed, I mean she is currently in magical stasis because she's been poisoned. They don't explicitly say she's poisoned until later in the book, but it's pretty clear that it's poison. And until then, her bastard stepbrother, if I say bastard, I mean he's not just a manipulative bastard, but he's an actual bastard. His father and mother weren't married, is the Prince Regent with Primate Aeneas, who is basically a Cardinal Richelieu figure, taking control of things. And we also set up that agents of basically Aeneas' somewhat lackey enforcer, a fallen Pandian knight by the name of Martel, are also in town. Martel being basically the Comte de Rochefort figure. If you've read or seen any version of the Three Musketeers, you know who that is. If you only watch movies and don't remember names, that's the dude with the eye patch, who D'Artagnan has a big thing for. By the way, no real D'Artagnan figure in this. But anyway, the Pandian Knights can safely be described as the Musketeers. And we are also introduced to Sepharina. Sepharina is a Styric, which is a race or ethnic group of people. It can be kind of summarized as fantasy gypsies, except they're not nomadic. They have villages, they're rejected and outcast from society, they have magic, and we'll get more. They were a different religion, and I'll get into them a little more later. Alternatively, you could say they're fantasy Saxons, or that sort of, or fantasy Celts, that sort of thing. Anyway, we set up that basically Ilhan has been put in stasis by Zephrina and 13 knights. This stasis spell is bound to their life force. As it goes on, their life force will drain until all 13 knights and Zephrina are dead, at which point Ilhan will die shortly thereafter, which sets up our main quest, which is our heroes need to find a cure. In the meantime, all while this is going on, Martell and Martell and Aeneas are busy basically trying to keep the Pandian Knights busy at every turn, to strip them of power, to get in their way, to get them disbanded if at all possible. Them and the other martial orders of knights, get them all disbanded and out of their hair at every turn, for reasons which aren't made too clear until later. At first glance, things appear to be very petty partisan politics. Not partisan politics, but just very petty politics, which is really odd considering some of the steps that Martell takes to try to disband the Pandian Knights, and the other martial knights in general, but primarily the Pandians at first. Early on in the book, Martell, through his operative Krager, tries to hire a group of mercenaries, have them attack one of the allies of the kingdom of Elenia, and basically do a massacre. Kill everybody, particularly priests, especially priests, which I found odd considering that Aeneas was a priest, and willing to sacrifice his own power group essentially like this. And then, in the course of this, basically frame the Pandian Knights. They would have a couple of survivors who were plants, have them come back to town, and say, "Oh, the Pandian Knights did this horrible thing," at which point the Pandian Knights would be confined to their chapter house while there's an investigation, and they'd be out of Aeneas' hair for good. And, in short, the plot is thwarted so incredibly easily that it makes Aeneas almost completely completely worthless as a threat. They figured out fairly quickly. They stop the attack, and they bait Aeneas, set up a sort of political trap to make Aeneas look like an idiot and discredit him. Like, really heavily discredit him. He is lost by the time they're done. He's basically lost a great deal of his influence. You have Aeneas also trying to make a play for basically fantasy pope. They don't call it pope, but it's essentially the pope. He's the head of the Hellene Church. And this, again, it appears to be put at a standstill because of Aeneas' plot falling apart at the seams. And other than that, the other major notable thing, as far as these early plot points, is Martell throwing various roadblocks in the characters' way. Over the course of this, we're also introduced to a small group of knights from various other orders who aren't really fleshed out very well. There's the one guy who's kind of very pious. There's the one guy who's a bit more fast and loose with things, who's basically would be the Aramis if we didn't already have an Aramis in Kurik. Porthos. I can never get those. Porthos. And then there's Barhawk's basically Athos. The more naive guy is more Aramis, but the more pious guy is more Aramis, and Kurik is more Athos. But we have another guy who could potentially be either alternatively both alternatively both Porthos or Athos, depending on how you think about it. Something he was doing. And his distinctive trait, aside from being more fast and loose with things, is he has a giant axe. Giant polearm axe, a Lochaber. And there's a few other guys, but that's mainly a group of dudes. And they basically follow around our characters for about a section of the book, and then they kind of drop out for the remainder of it. we get to, after briefly going to Fantasy Rome, we get to the medical town. One other thing I almost forgot. There's two other characters who are introduced who are basically our two Scrappy Kid characters. One who follows us for all the remainder of the book, the other one who kind of drops in and out. The one who drops in and out is named Talon. He is your typical street urchin, thief, master pickpocket, yada yada. They set up that Kurik is he's the illegitimate son of Kurik, but not much goes with that. I mean, Kurik's kind of his father figure. They use him for some exposition to explain the background of the martial knights. And the other one is Flute, who is a young Styric girl who was rescued from a village that's been destroyed by Krager's men. And she doesn't talk, she just uses the flute for general and body language for general communications and casting spells. And we go to Fantasy Rome. We establish that the Fantasy Pope is dying. We also establish the evil god of evil / our Morgoth figure, Azash. And basically establish that the various orders of paladins were formed to fight him once in the past. They beat him, and now he's sort of reasserting himself now. They go to the town of the big hospital and all the best physicians, and they've all been bought off by Martell, thinking very well ahead. And they won't talk to them except for basically the one guy who doesn't give a fuck, who tells them to go to this other kingdom, which is basically fantasy North Africa, to get the information they need. And this is where really the book starts running into problems. All this book, they never do a good job of doing a sense of place for everywhere. Fantasy Rome, I call it Fantasy Rome because that's where the Fantasy Pope is. It could be Fantasy London, it could be Fantasy Paris, it could be Fantasy Brandenburg, or for that matter, it could be the middle of nowhere. I can read it a little bit because of who's there. And I'll assume politically this is a big place. But it could totally not be, at all. And there's nothing in the book to explain otherwise. There is no sense of where we are. No sense of, this is a big town, this is a small town. Most books, particularly fantasy books, to some degree science fiction as well, but particularly fantasy books, do take a lot of time trying to make where you are feel important and give a sense of place. Of this town even if it's just by like small things of where the characters are and what they're doing, using that to build on things and say, okay, for example, Ankh-Morpork, it's a giant city of multiple different architectural styles, and it's a very bizarre city where you have stuff like the Unseen University, the School of Magic, which is, we assume, is giant walls, and things explode there a large portion of the time because the experiment's going on, and that sort of thing. A better example is in the Thieves' World books, the city of Sanctuary, which is as much a character in the books as One Thumb, the bartender of the Vulgar Unicorn. The books do a good job of painting the of all the different districts of Sanctuary. There's the Noble District. There's the slums. There's slums which are even more nastier than the main slums. There's the various gangsters and that sort of thing. Every place feels like it's significant and means something. And let's say means something, but it has a history. Again, Blankmar. The religion's there. We don't know all the gods, but there's gods beyond knowing. But from the gods we do know, we know that there are there's a plurality of gods. There's the gods in Lankhmar, people who brought their religions with them and built temples. There's the gods of Lankhmar. The gods in Lankhmar are moderately fleshed out. There's more than they describe in depth, but there's multiple religions. The gods have names. They have followers. There's gods of Lankhmar, which have no names and no followers, and both sides like it this way. And that's significant in the setting because the gods of Lankhmar are things people you don't trifle with. In fact, you just don't mess with at all. Whereas in this book, there's none of that. The fantasy Egypt that they go to, Debor and all these other cities, all in the country of Rendor. They don't really describe them. I assume they're built like North African cities because it's a desert country. So we have brick and that sort of thing. Lots of clay. But for all I know, it could be that some of these towns have a lot more wood around them, and there's wood structures, or it's desert, but around like some of the towns, it's a more stone desert, and so things are built more out of stone. Or even maybe a town might be built in basically a recess in a wall or in a cave, like some of the Anansi towns. Not Anansi town, but some of the various native towns in the American Southwest, and that sort of thing. We don't get any sense of this at all. And that's really disappointing. With the god pantheon, aside from Azash, no gods have names. There's the troll gods, whose power infuses the Belam, and are linked to more of the dark and sinister beings, but they're not fleshed out. They have no names. They're just called the troll gods. We don't know if are they good, are they bad, are they vengeful, are they apathetic. The Aline god is the Aline god a New Testament, I am merciful and forgiving God? Is it an Old Testament vengeance god? It doesn't say. And that's the problem with this book. It's the real problem with this book. So, they go to the Kingdom of Rendor, and a few little adventures. Our heroes travel then to see Debor, where they learn that the cure that was used on this poison before was a magical gemstone. And in the process of administering before the gemstone was destroyed, to be ground into a powder and administered orally. However, the cure can be administered without doing this, and so they just need to get another gemstone. Problem is, these magical gemstones are rare, and you can't just make one yourself. But there is hope. They get a vision. Sparhawk gets a vision through the spirit of the previous king, who was a bit of a dick, of the aforementioned Belhom, and that is the stone that can save the life of Princess Queen Ahana, and can save the kingdom from the evil and the land from the evil forces of Azash if they're able to get to it before it's too late. That's where the book ends. And aside from the thing I mentioned about the lack of sense of place, which is a really big problem for fantasy, the one other major real problem I have with this book is with basically all our little villains here, aside from Azash himself, are stuck holding the idiot ball. The plan for Primate Aeneas falls apart very quickly. After they basically deal with him at the start of the book, he becomes a minor player and not a major threat for the remainder of the book. Same general thing for Martel. He is a threat for most of the book and is generally ahead of the main characters, but as soon as they meet him face to face, he's holding the idiot ball, and they can quickly and decisively destroy his plans and ruin his day. And all that really does is it undermines them horribly. They try to explain this by saying that Azash is used to controlling the minds of Styrics, and their minds are simpler and less complicated than Aline minds, but I really don't buy it. It feels instead like David Eddings was unable to write a good villain, or that he didn't want to write too good a villain because he wanted to save the better villains for the later books. So it was like, well, if I hand him a petty villain here, then I can more easily up the stakes in later books by having more threatening villains, because anybody's more threatening than this guy. I don't want anyone who's more threatening than this guy. I want this antagonist to be threatening. I want, like, in Lord of the Rings, in the Fellowship, you didn't have much recurring antagonists, but you had the actions of Saruman menacing our characters, and you had Lurtz menacing our characters. In particular, Lurtz directly attacking them. He doesn't really show up that much as far as the name of the leader of the group of Uruk-hai that show up in books. He's more of a creation of the films, but it gives us a menacing opponent who we take care of in the first book, or the first third of the installment. In the second book, while Sauron is not defeated, Saruman is primarily crushed. Saruman's plans are thwarted, at least his plans related to Isengard are thwarted, and we're setting up the big battle for the next book. In the third book, we finally deal with all our villains, not all at the same time. Saruman and Sauron are defeated at different times. Sauron first, then Saruman a little bit later, but they're both taken care of. They're taken care of decisively, and it's basically a resolution that really feels like it means something. It is truly a climactic resolution. Here, the main threat here is time. The main menace here is time. We have to find the cure before all the knights die. And over the course of this, several of these knights who took part in this ritual do die and symbolically deliver their swords to Sepharina to show that she's taking on their burden. And it does set up a degree of time here. But the problem is, I feel, is we get too many of them here. They've got like 4 or 5 of them who drop dead in this book. And they die too quickly. What should be happening, pacing-wise, is Aeneas and Martell should be our antagonists, should be our primary antagonists from the majority of this book. Plus, there is the time threat. But they should be more of an actual obstacle. They should be doing more to try and stop our hero's progress. So, by the end of the book, one of the two should be taken care of, should be removed. Ideally, this should be Aeneas. Aeneas is a bureaucratic threat, a bureaucratic petty threat. His plot line should be resolved more or less by like the end of the book. Martell should still be active, because he is an actual physical combatant menace. Martell is not necessarily, he's a political threat, he's a manipulator, but he can't necessarily muster a force of orcs or other enemies to get in our hero's way. Martell is set up, can do that, can send troops our hero's way, and is set up, at least early on in the book, before we finally meet him face to face, as in every way the equal of Sparhawk. Sparhawk is the only person who's ever been able to overcome him in combat, sort of. So, when we get a true face-to-face combat between them, it should be a case where it's a toss-up. And so ideally, the next book in this series, Martell should be our main antagonist, and he should be a threat. He should be our main face-to-face and threat for our heroes in stopping their attempts to obtain the Belam. But from what I'm getting at the end of this book, I'm not seeing that happening at all. Martell's plans are kind of thwarted. If he does show up, he's no longer an intellectual, an intelligent threat to our heroes. He's just kind of a threat. If he tries to fight our heroes in combat, then he becomes a problem. He's not going to lay traps for them. He's not dubious or devious enough as under the control of at least Azash anyway, to become a problem. Aeneas definitely is not enough political threat to become a problem. In fact, he's probably a political non-entity now. So, in conclusion, should you read this book? Should you read The Diamond Throne? Or should you find something better to do with your time? And in short, don't bother. It's not a good book. If I was in middle school and high school, I would have cared, because it was a fantasy book and I was eating up fantasy no matter what it was. But now there's so much better fantasy out there. Maybe about political intrigue, there's a Game of Thrones. If you want swords and sorcery, there's so much swords and sorcery, from Conan to Fafhrd to Elric. It's just, this book doesn't feel like it's like anything other than super generic fantasy. I mean, Wheel of Time had more sense of danger and urgency to it than this book does. And were it not for the fact that the book series is gigantic and is way too intimidating to a newcomer, I'd recommend that one series instead. But not this one. And that's pretty much it. I'll see you next time.